We do begin tonight with the new images now emerging of that horrific explosive crash. A UPS cargo jet seconds after takeoff from Louisville, Kentucky.
Imagine a large jet going down because of a problem buried so deep that no one noticed it for years. On November 4th, 2025, a UPS freighter lifted off from Louisville and crashed moments later, leaving behind fire, destruction, and heartbreaking loss. When investigators dug into the wreckage, they found something so serious that it pushed federal officials to rewrite the rules for cargo jets overnight. The takeoff that turned into a firestorm. Late on a clear Tuesday afternoon, Louisville Muhammad Ali International Airport was doing what it does almost every day. Cargo jets were lining up, trucks were feeding packages into the UPS hub, and thousands of workers were moving boxes under a bright Kentucky sky. The weather was calm, the runway was dry, and nothing about the shift looked unusual. One of the departures was UPS Flight 2976, a three-engine McDonnell Douglas MD-11 freighter. The airplane had started life in the early 1990s as a passenger jet before being converted into a cargo workhorse and joining the UPS fleet in the mid-2000s. By 2025, it was more than 34 years old and a regular visitor to Louisville. This flight was headed to Honolulu. That route crosses the continent and then a huge stretch of the Pacific Ocean, so the crew needed a very heavy fuel load, roughly 38,000 gallons of jet fuel, well over 200,000 pounds. In the cockpit were three experienced pilots with thousands of hours on large jets, including long-time experience on the MD-11. There were no passengers, only crew, fuel, and stacks of packages in the long cargo hold. For people who work at Worldport, UPS's 5 million square foot sorting center at the edge of the airport, a departure like this is completely routine. Every night, more than 2 million packages move through that complex, with aircraft coming and going in tight waves, and Flight 2976 blended into that normal flow. To picture what happened next, think about a takeoff in simple terms. The pilots line up, push the thrust levers forward, and the airplane races down the pavement. At first, if something goes wrong, there is still room to hit the brakes and stop. But there is a point, called the decision speed, where they are basically committed to flying. Once they pass that point, trying to stop could be more dangerous than lifting off, even if there is a serious problem. According to tracking data and the first NTSB report, the start of the takeoff roll down runway 17 right at around 5:13 in the afternoon looked normal. Then, just as the jet was rotating to lift its nose, the left engine and much of its mounting structure suddenly tore away from the wing. Airport surveillance cameras and phone videos later showed the engine flipping up and over the leading edge, trailing fire, before tumbling onto the grass beside the runway. Flames broke out near the spot where the engine had been attached under the left wing, and that fire did not go out. Despite that huge loss, the MD-11 still managed to leave the ground. It climbed only a short distance, never getting more than a few stories above the terrain. It was moving at a speed similar to a car on a fast highway, just over 200 miles per hour, with the landing gear still down. Video clips show a growing orange glow on the left side of the airplane as the wing fire intensifies. Other footage and expert analysis suggest that the tail-mounted center engine may also have been hit by flying debris, sending bursts of flame from the exhaust and robbing the crew of even more thrust. Within seconds, the big cargo jet began to roll and drift left. With one wing on fire and the engines no longer pushing evenly, the airplane could not climb cleanly away from the airport. It cleared the fence at the end of the runway, but instead of rising, it slipped toward the busy industrial strip that sits just beyond the airfield in a part of Louisville called Takeoff. The first major impact came when the left main landing gear smashed into the roof of a UPS Supply Chain Solutions warehouse at the southern edge of the airport, ripping open a gash almost the length of a football field. Inside that building, people who had been loading and sorting freight suddenly found the ceiling collapsing, fire raining down, and the lights going out as the structure shook around them. The crippled jet did not stop there. Still rolling left, it plowed into the Kentucky Petroleum Recycling Depot next door, its left wing striking a cluster of fuel tanks. When those tanks ruptured, they sent up a huge fireball that was seen and filmed from miles away. The airplane then rolled even further, more than 90 degrees onto its side, before crashing into a parking area packed with semi-trailers and the Grade A auto parts scrapyard, full of cars, metal, fuel, and other flammable material. By the time the wreckage stopped, multiple buildings were burning or destroyed. The debris field stretched for roughly half a mile beyond the first impact point. Twisted metal from the airplane, shredded trailers, auto parts, and pieces of roofing were scattered across streets and parking lots, and a thick column of black smoke rose over Louisville for hours, visible across the city and even on satellite images taken from space. Inside the fire zone, workers and visitors had only seconds to react. Some people managed to run from warehouses and offices as alarms sounded and flames spread. Others were trapped by falling debris or sudden explosions. Early counts changed as crews searched the ruins, but officials now say 14 people were killed in the crash, all 3 crew members on the airplane and 11 people on the ground. Another 23 people on the ground were injured, and 2 of them were hurt badly. Among the dead were a 3-year-old girl and her grandfather, who had simply been going about a normal day when the jet came down. Survivors later described the scene as pure chaos. Workers told reporters they felt the building shudder, dove under desks or work tables, and then stumbled out into the open air, lit orange by fire. Others talked about choking on smoke while trying to help co-workers, or sprinting away as fuel tanks exploded behind them. First responders said the site looked almost apocalyptic, with rows of burning trucks and cars, and chunks of airplanes scattered everywhere. Louisville's emergency managers quickly realized that this was more than a normal industrial fire, because the jet had been carrying so much fuel and had crashed in a corridor full of chemicals, scrap metal, and plastics. Officials ordered people within about 5 miles of the airport to stay indoors. They told residents to close windows and doors, shut off air conditioning systems that might pull in outside air, and wait for updates on their phones and local news. More than 100 firefighters, medics, and hazmat specialists poured into the crash area. Their first job was to knock down the worst of the flames so they could safely reach the wreckage. After that came the search for survivors and the slow, careful work of making sure every hotspot was out and every corner of the debris field had been checked. By late that night, officials said the main fires were mostly contained, but crews stayed on scene, spraying foam and water, checking for leaking fuel, and watching for flare-ups. At the same time, the airport itself came to a halt. All flights in and out of Louisville were suspended for hours, and one of the main runways stayed closed longer as investigators and cleanup teams worked around the wreckage. UPS temporarily stopped operations at Worldport, freezing a major piece of the overnight shipping network. Public schools in the surrounding district were closed the next day, in part because of air quality concerns and in part because so many families and workers were directly touched by the crash. Families looking for loved ones were told not to rush to hospitals, which were already busy with burn and smoke inhalation cases. Instead, police opened a reunification center where people could register missing relatives and wait for news. At one point, more than a dozen families had reported someone missing. In the days that followed, as bodies were recovered and names confirmed, city leaders slowly announced that everyone on those lists had finally been found, though not always alive. By then, the wider picture was becoming clear. This was the deadliest accident in UPS history, and one of the worst crashes ever to involve an MD-11. Once the flames on the ground were under control, and the last survivors had been pulled from the wreckage, the focus began to shift. Fire crews and local police kept watch over the smoldering ruins, but a different group of people started to take the lead. The specialists whose job is to figure out, step by step, how a routine takeoff turned into a firestorm in just a few heartbeats. Inside, the race to find the truth. In the United States, the investigation mainly belongs to the National Transportation Safety Board, the NTSB. They are an independent safety agency whose mission is to learn what went wrong and how to stop it from happening again. The Federal Aviation Administration, the FAA, looks after flying rules and supports the work, but the NTSB leads the search for answers. Within hours of the crash, the NTSB launched what they call a go team to Louisville. About 28 specialists arrived at Louisville Muhammad Ali International Airport the next day, along with engineers and observers from the FAA, from United Parcel Service, from Boeing, from General Electric, and from the Pilots Union. Together, they covered structures, engines, flight operations, human factors, and airport issues. Their first goal was to secure anything that could carry information. That meant the 2 black boxes. Despite the name, these recorders are bright orange so that searchers can see them in wreckage. Every large jet carries a cockpit voice recorder, the CVR, and a flight data recorder, the FDR. One records cockpit sound, the other tracks the plane's vital signs. Both recorders from Flight 2976 were found in the debris field, burned on the outside but still in one piece. They were flown to the NTSB's recorder lab in Washington, D.C., where specialists opened the crash-protected memory units, cleaned away soot and melted material, and connected them to special readers. They were able to pull out good quality information from both recorders, including the entire accident flight. When NTSB board member Todd Inman spoke to the press, he shared one of the first clear clues from the recordings. About 37 seconds after the crew called for takeoff power, a bell started to sound in the cockpit. It was not a single chime. It was a repeating, steady bell that kept going for about 25 seconds, right up to the end of the recording. During that whole time, the crew could be heard trying to fly the aircraft and keep control. At that early stage, the investigators did not say exactly which system the bell belonged to. Modern jets have different tones for different warnings, and some of them sound alike. But on many aircraft, a repeating bell means a serious problem, such as an engine fire or another major system failure. For the team, it clearly marked the moment when the pilots knew something had gone badly wrong. While the audio group studied the sounds, the data group rebuilt the short flight in numbers and pictures. They combined the flight data recorder output with radar tracks and signals from the plane's automatic tracking beacon, known as ADSB. By lining up those sources, they could see how fast the jet was moving, how far it got from the ground, and how quickly it rolled and fell in the final seconds. This confirmed that the takeoff roll itself looked normal at first. Then something sudden happened while the plane was still racing down the runway. Security cameras around the airport had already captured parts of that moment. Investigators froze those clips frame by frame and matched them to the timestamps from the data recorders. That work helped set the order of events. Back at the crash site, another group was busy with a more hands-on job. They laid out the debris field on a map and divided it into a grid. Every large piece of wreckage was tagged and photographed where it lay before being moved. Far closer to the runway, along the left side, searchers found the entire left engine and much of the pylon structure. The pylon is like a strong bracket that holds the engine under the wing. That bracket is fixed to the wing at two main spots, a forward mount closer to the nose and an aft mount closer to the tail. Each mount has thick metal ears called lugs and a big round joint in the middle called a spherical bearing. The wing side has its own matching fork, called the wing clevis, and a heavy bolt goes through everything to tie it together. The bearing lets the engine move a tiny bit as the wing flexes, while the lugs and bolt take the main load. Investigators brought the engine and its broken mounting hardware to a secure hangar so that later they could examine every bolt hole and fracture line under bright lights and microscopes. At the same time, other specialists began building a life story for the airplane itself. They pulled the aircraft's maintenance logs, repair records, and inspection reports. They noted that this MD-11 had first flown in the early 1990s as a passenger jet before being converted to a freighter years later, and that by the time of the crash it had spent more than 3 decades in hard service. They reviewed the recent heavy maintenance visit in Texas, when the jet had been taken out of service for several weeks so that a cracked fuel tank could be repaired, and corrosion found in some internal beams could be treated. None of those facts on their own proved anything, but they raised clear questions. Had every inspection of the engine mounts been done on time and in the right way? Were there places on the pylon that were hard to reach or easy to miss during a routine visual check? Could years of cargo work, with heavy fuel loads and long flights, have slowly worn down some key part until it finally gave way on that November evening? All the arrows were pointing toward a single place where the engine met the wing. To move beyond that hunch, they would have to go deeper, cutting into the broken mount itself and studying the metal in detail. What they discovered in that hardware would turn a terrible crash into a much bigger warning for every older cargo jet still flying. The hidden cracks that brought the jet down. When investigators laid out the parts from the left engine mount, they saw at once that this neat picture had come apart in a very ugly way. On the wing fragment from that side, they found the aft mount hardware. The clevis, the spherical bearing, and the bolt still stuck in place. The matching lugs from the pylon side were gone from there. Those broken lugs were instead found up by runway 17 right, where the left engine first came off. The NTSB Materials Lab then looked at those lugs and the bearing under a microscope. Their preliminary report says both the forward and aft lugs on that aft mount had cracked and then snapped. On the aft lug, they found fine beach mark patterns on both sides of the break, the classic sign of metal fatigue. On the forward lug, they saw fatigue along the bore on one side and a final rough, overstress break on the other, which means it broke suddenly after carrying too much load. The spherical bearing was also found broken in a ring, with the inner ball exposed. For people who do not live in this world, fatigue can sound like the metal just got tired in one day. That is not how it works. Think of bending a paperclip back and forth. Each bend does almost nothing at first, but inside, tiny cracks grow a little bit every time until suddenly the clip snaps. The same thing can happen in metal parts on airplanes. Every takeoff and landing flexes and loads the mounts. Over thousands of cycles, small cracks can start at sharp corners or at the edge of a hole and grow slowly, even when the stress on each flight is normal. The final seconds look like a sudden break, but the real damage has been building for years. Under the heavy push of that takeoff, with a full fuel load for a long trip to Hawaii, the cracked lug finally let go. Once that first lug fractured, the job of holding the engine shifted onto the remaining lug and the bearing. They were never meant to carry that much load alone. In a split second, they were pulled past their limits and failed too. That is why the forward lug shows more signs of a sudden overload break. Once both lugs and the bearing gave way, the entire pylon aft mount tore free, and the left engine vaulted up and over the wing, just as seen in security videos. If this story sounds familiar to older engineers, there is a reason. Back in the late 1970s, American Airlines Flight 191, a McDonnell Douglas DC-10, lost its left engine and pylon during takeoff from Chicago. In that case, an engine change done with a forklift had bent and cracked the pylon mount months earlier. During a later takeoff, the weakened mount failed. The engine went over the wing, ripped away a section of the leading edge, and the plane rolled over and crashed. One of the big questions, of course, is why normal checks did not catch these cracks in time. The mounts on jets like this have special inspection rules. The manufacturer sets a number of flights after which a very detailed check of the mount must be done. For this aft mount, that deep inspection was set to start at around 28,000 cycles. This particular jet had not yet reached that trigger number. By the time of the crash, it had logged about 92,992 flight hours and just over 21,000 flight cycles. It had been through more basic visual checks, including one in October 2021, and nothing was written up about the left aft mount at that time. Once investigators reached that point, their focus shifted. The question was no longer just, why did one UPS jet come apart on takeoff? The bigger fear became, how many other hard-working freighters are flying right now with the same hidden damage in the same place? And what does that mean for every airport and every community under their flight paths? The fallout. Groundings, lawsuits, and big changes. Ahead. The first big shock came from the regulators. Just 4 days after the crash, the Federal Aviation Administration issued an emergency airworthiness directive for every MD-11 and MD-11 freighter in the country. In simple terms, an airworthiness directive is a legally binding safety order. An emergency one is the strongest tool the FAA has. It tells operators, you are not allowed to fly this type again until you do these checks and fix whatever we find. In this case, the order grounded the type until detailed inspections of the engine mounts were done using a method the FAA itself approved. That order didn't remain a short memo. Within a few weeks, the FAA turned it into a longer-term rule that replaces the quick emergency stop with a full inspection program going forward. Until operators can prove each airframe is safe under the new standards, those aircraft stay on the ground. Grounding a whole model is rare. The MD-11 and its close cousin, the DC-10, are not passenger workhorses anymore, but they still matter a lot in cargo. Before the crash, there were a little over 100 MD-11s in service worldwide, and about 10 more DC-10-based freighters, most of them flying boxes at night for big names like UPS, FedEx, and Western Global Airlines. When the FAA order hit, UPS parked its roughly 24 MD-11s, which make up close to 1/10 of its fleet, and FedEx did the same with its own Tri-Js. This all happened just as the busy holiday shipping season was starting. Instead of their usual pattern of MD-11s moving heavy loads through hubs like Louisville, Memphis, Dallas-Fort Worth, and Ontario in California, the big cargo firms had to reshuffle everything. Some routes were handed to twin-engine jets like Boeing 767s and 777s or Airbus freighters. Some loads were shifted to charter carriers. Some shipments simply took longer. The grounding may last into early 2026 because Boeing and the FAA still have to agree on how often those engine mounts must be checked and what repairs are good enough to clear each airframe. For Western Global, a smaller airline that leans heavily on MD-11s, the impact has been even harsher. With most of its core fleet under the ban, the carrier has furloughed all of its MD-11 pilots and is now fighting to stay in the market while the inspection rules shake out. In Louisville, a resident and 2 nearby businesses have filed a proposed class action case in federal court against UPS, Boeing, and General Electric, which built the engines. They claim that design choices, maintenance gaps, or bad warnings helped cause a preventable disaster that wiped out buildings, jobs, and lives on the ground. National aviation firms, such as Clifford Law Offices, have also stepped in to represent families of the dead, saying they will dig through maintenance records, inspection reports, and internal emails to see who knew what about engine mount risks before this flight ever lined up on the runway. At the same time, many people think this crash may speed up the end of the MD-11 era. Even before Louisville, big carriers were slowly moving to twin-engine cargo jets that burn less fuel and have better safety records. Now, with the fleet grounded and expensive inspections and repairs ahead, it may be easier for some companies to retire their Trigets early rather than pour more money into them. For operators that keep them, the price of proving they are safe will almost certainly climb. Thanks for watching. Now check out the videos popping up on screen for more unbelievable stories.